Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is Sarah Huckins, a Partnership Manager for Island Press, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Community Resilience in an Era of Upheaval, Lessons from Richard Heinberg and Rebecca Water. Today's webinar is put on in collaboration with our partner, Post Carbon Institute, and the focus of our conversation will be PCI's book, The Community Resilience Reader, to which our participants contributed. Founded in 2003, PCI's mission to lead the transition to a more resilient, equitable, and sustainable world by providing individuals the resources necessary to respond to the E4 crises, which we'll learn about more soon. So we have Daniel Lurch as our moderator today. And in addition to contributing to the Community Resilience Reader, he is Education and Publications Director of Post Carbon Institute and is responsible for PCI's educational efforts on community resilience and energy resource constraints. He has been the lead editor and manager of the Institute's major books and reports over the last decade, including the Community Resilience Reader, published in 2017, and the Post Carbon Reader in 2010. We want to thank Daniel and the PCI team for their support, and we are excited to have them in today's conversation. Before we dive in, I just want to mention Island Press's Urban Resilience Project. The Urban Resilience Project at Island Press works to imagine and inspire the sustainable, equitable cities of the future. This project brings together a diverse group of thought leaders and environmental activists to generate and cross-pollinate ideas. Those ideas are then shared in a variety of media, and the short form pieces from 2007 has been collected in a new ebook entitled Resilience Matters, Transformative Thinking in a Year of Crisis, available online now at no cost. So we hope you will find it to be a valuable resource and encourage you to download a free copy from the link provided. And I also want to thank our attendees today for your interest and for tuning in, and just want to give you all a quick look at our agenda for today's webinar. Daniel will give a brief introduction to our panelists and provide an explanation of the Resilience Reader's concept and framework, and then we'll hear from Richard and Rebecca. After their presentations, Daniel will facilitate an audience question and answer session. So we encourage you to participate by entering questions in through the GoTo platform. There should be a little section for questions, so please do chime in. Also, for those of you who would like to revisit this webinar or share it after it airs, we will be posting it to our video page, as well as we have uploaded the presentation deck as a handout, so you can download those as well. And we'll also be offering a 20% off discount code for the Community Resilience Reader. So stay tuned at the end of the webinar for that slide. But for now, I will let Daniel take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So again, my name is Daniel Lurch. I'm the editor of the Community Resilience Reader. And I'm going to actually do my introduction first of the book and the material, and then I'm going to introduce Richard and Rebecca more fully right before they get into their slides, so that way you all remember who they are and why we have them here. So Post Carbon is a think tank working on energy literacy and resilience literacy, and we basically target what we call the walking worried. That's essentially people who understand that there are a lot of sustainability problems and other problems in the world and want to do something about it, but maybe feel stymied or just want to understand more, understand that it's a complex thing to deal with. Our fellows include people like Richard Heinberg here, and Bill McKibben, Sandra Pistel, David Orr, and many other experts and advocates in a variety of fields you may be familiar with. Right now, just for a very brief couple minutes, I want to give a very quick overview of why and how this book came about. So its roots go back to 2009 when we were developing our first major book, The Post Carbon Reader. President Obama was fresh in office, and it seemed like climate change was finally starting to be taken at least marginally seriously. But the pain of the previous year's financial crisis was still very real. Energy prices were sky high, and it was starting to seem to many people that we were looking at a coming together of the world's multiple sustainability crises. So we produced the Post-Carbon Reader to help push the public conversation about sustainability beyond climate change and get people thinking more in terms of complexity and energy issues. One of the chapters in that book was a chapter on resilience, which we commissioned Bill Reese, the co-originator of the ecological footprint concept, to produce. And at the time, 2009, 2010, resilience was more commonly associated with its meanings in the fields of engineering and psychology. But for years, people working on community-scale relocalization and other environmental issues had increasingly been using a version of resilience that was drawn from the field of ecosystem management. And we at Post-Carbon and others felt that this version of resilience was more applicable to the challenges that we were facing in modern industrial society. I kind of see three things that distinguish this particular version of resilience that really inform the whole point of this book. First is that the thing of interest in this version of resilience is that is a system that includes both natural and human elements. This is what's known as a joint social ecological system. Second, these kinds of systems, they're not complicated, but rather they're complex, which means that there's a certain amount of unpredictability and flux to them. And third, it finds that building the capacity of these systems to handle disruption isn't just about bouncing back per se, but it's about both adapting and even transforming the identity of these systems. And this identity is something that we collectively choose because humans are part of these systems. So that's, obviously there's a whole lot to get into there, but you can see right away, I think that this is a very different kind of concept of resilience than just infrastructure or engineering resilience. There we go, next slide. Well, so things suddenly changed in the world in 2012, or at least in the States, in 2012. Superstorm Sandy made a connection in people's minds between climate change impacts and complex modern urban communities in a way that previous storms hadn't, not even Hurricane Katrina. And books about urban and societal resilience started appearing. And this term resilience quickly became a term that people used to talk about preparing cities for the new disruptions of the 21st century. Rockefeller Foundation, Kresge Foundation, those two really stand out as two of the many organizations that sought to understand and influence the public conversation about resilience. As the years went by, though, we at Post-Carbon Institute, and others, of course, noticed some concerning trends. We did some small research projects, and we came to a few conclusions. One was that the efforts of the Kresges and the Rockefellers notwithstanding, this concept of urban resilience was on a trend to become just climate adaptation 2.0. And this is concerning because focusing just on climate adaptation can miss all the other big urgent sustainability challenges that also need our attention. Again, these are very complex systems we're dealing with. And second, the insights of resilience science, and particularly social ecological systems resilience science, were not filtering out of academia. And this was concerning because resilience science offers essential tools for grappling with these large systems challenges. I am not able to, oh, there we go. Sorry for the lag here on changing slides. So at Post-Carbon Institute, we embarked on a multi-year effort on resilience, literacy, and education, kind of in response to all this. And this had a focus not just on the walking worried, as I mentioned before, but also on the broader public, and in particular, learners both inside and outside colleges. So the Community Resilience Reader, the topic of this webinar, is the latest of 3 projects within this effort, and it builds on the first 2, which I'll try to describe briefly here. The very first project was a 2015 report titled 6 Foundations for Building Community Resilience, and this is actually adapted into the first chapter of the book. Among the goals of this report were to make the concept of resilience accessible to non-specialists, to clarify the relationship between sustainability and resilience, and to show the utility and relevance of resilience for not just rural but also urban communities in modern industrial society. And really key to this approach, and one thing that I think is probably the most important here, are these 2 words here in the title, building and community. So community in the sense of doing this work at the local level is particularly effective. So we wanted to put a highlight on that. And the word building to reinforce that resilience is a quality to continually cultivate and not just a goal to try to achieve. The second project in this series was our Think Resilience online course, launched early last year at education.resilience.org, hosting, again, Richard Heinberg here on the webinar with us. This aimed to make all this material we developed over the years accessible to a much wider audience, and it included and refined our thinking on aspects of community resilience like systems thinking, local economies, urban support systems, and social justice. And we're actually launching a guided course version of that in just 2 weeks with Richard. And go to that website to learn more. So that brings us to the third project, the topic of this webinar, the Community Resilience Reader, an academic quality book that digs into all of these issues through chapters by subject matter experts and within a framework that organizes all this complex and sometimes challenging material into terms of a problem statement, tools to address the problems, and then examples of those tools in action. So in this webinar, Richard is going to talk about material in part 1, understanding our predicament. And then Rebecca is going to give us a taste of part 3, community resilience in action, through the work that has informed her contribution to the book that's in that section. And unfortunately, we don't have time to cover part 2, gathering the needed tools. But in some ways, that's really the heart of the book, featuring crash course chapters in systems thinking, sustainability science, and resilience science. So with that, let me introduce the next speaker, Richard Heinberg. Richard is my colleague at Post Carbon Institute. He's our senior fellow in residence, widely regarded as one of the world's foremost advocates for a shift away from our current reliance on fossil fuels. He's written for Nature, Wall Street Journal, Reuters, the Christian Science Monitor, and many other publications, and has delivered hundreds of lectures on energy and climate issues to audiences around the world. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Daniel. And here I am pushing my car. No, this is my first slide, and it's really meant to illustrate the fact that all of this, in one way or another, has to do with energy. Why is it important for us to build a community and societal resilience right now at this point in history? It's because we're facing a series of crises, all related in one way or another to energy. And why energy? Well, it's energy that makes everything possible that we do within society. And over the course of the last couple of hundred years, we've gained access to energy sources that were completely unlike anything that we used before, which was mostly, food crops and firewood. Just one sort of intuitive gauge of that is this little thought experiment. Imagine pushing your car, 20 or 30 miles. That would be a lot of work, maybe weeks of work, if you could even do it. But we get that service done for us by, a gallon of gasoline, for which we're paying, I don't know, here in California, a little over $3 a gallon. It's that concentrated, portable, cheap, abundant energy that has enabled civilization to grow over the last couple of hundred years, and population to grow from under 1 billion at that time to over 7 billion today, 7.5 billion. If you look at the energy content of oil, it's just extraordinary compared to the energy of human muscles. A barrel of oil, if we thought of it in those terms, would be $500,000 worth of energy. But of course, currently we're paying $65 for a barrel of oil. It's just it's extraordinary, the benefit, that the economic benefit that fossil fuels have offered. But of course, that economic benefit has also come at an extraordinary cost. And now the slide advancing mechanism is no longer available to me. It comes and goes. Here we go. There. And this benefit of cheap, abundant, portable, storable energy has impacted all aspects of our society, starting with agriculture, which used to be our primary energy producing mechanism for society. Today, we invest a lot more energy in agriculture than it actually produces. This is what agriculture used to look like. And again, the slide advancing mechanism has gone away. Here it is back. Hello, there. Oh dear, too many. This is what agriculture looks like now. And so it used to take a lot of people, 70% of the population, something like that, back in agrarian times. Now it's 1% or less of the population who can do all we need in terms of farming. So that's freed up enormous numbers of people to do other things. That's, the growth of the middle class really is traceable very much to fossil fuels. It's reshaped society in profound ways. This is just a look at global energy consumption per capita since 1850. And as you can see, we still use firewood, which was our primary source of fuel. In those early times, we use less of it per capita. On a total basis, we use a lot more because, of course, there are a lot more capitas today, a lot more people. But we've just added new energy sources on top of existing ones to the point where now, we're using over 8 times as much per capita as we were in 1850, and that's averaged over all of humanity. Most human beings are living in relatively poor societies compared to what we're used to in the United States. Here in the U.S., we have one of the highest rates of per capita energy use. Okay, now let's see. Trying to get that. Here it is. Also, manufacturing changed profoundly as a result of the energy transition. With powered assembly lines, we could make stuff faster than people were accustomed to buying and using stuff, and we were inventing all kinds of new products. So during the early 20th century, this created a real problem, which was the problem of overproduction. It was one of the things that led to the Great Depression. So we found ways of dealing with overproduction, a couple of important strategies. One was the advertising industry, and along with that, planned obsolescence, to try to get people to buy and use more stuff and throw it away as fast as possible and replace it with new stuff. And the other strategy was consumer credit, making it easier for people to go into debt to consume now and pay later. So these have transformed our economy. We have created what we now call the consumer economy, again, as a result of cheap, abundant energy. And we take that for granted. The consumer economy, another way of thinking of it, is the growth economy. We have collectively bought into the idea that the economy always has to grow, that economic growth is normal and natural and foreordained somehow. But all of this that I've been describing has been kind of a bargain with the devil. Why? Because it's predicated on cheap, abundant fossil energy, and there are two do or die problems with fossil energy. One is depletion, the fact that these are non-renewable, depleting resources, and the other is burning fossil fuels as a historic chemistry experiment with changing the chemistry of the Earth's atmosphere and the world's oceans. And so far, that experiment is not going particularly well. I want to talk just a little bit about depletion, because that's something that isn't talked about nearly as much as climate change. I see the word conventional got divvied up here in the process of transferring the slides, but you can see what that's about. We harvest fossil fuels using the low-hanging fruit principle. In other words, we start at the top of this pyramid and dig our way down, getting the cheapest and best fossil fuels first and leaving the nasty, dirty, hard to get, expensive to get fossil fuels later. Well, with regard to oil and natural gas, we're down here around the price technology limit. We have technology for extracting more fossil fuels, namely hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling. But in order to use those technologies, we need a very high price. In order to use those technologies profitably, we need a very high price for fossil fuels. And actually, right now, the price isn't high enough. So the companies that are specializing in fracking for shale gas and tight oil are mostly doing so at a financial loss. But the market is propping them up because we have low interest rates, which makes it easier for them to borrow money, and a lot of money is floating around in the financial world these days, looking for some place that might make money sometime. And the fracking industry is very good at advertising itself as being, a good place to invest. So, meanwhile, we're digging our way down to the energy in equals energy out limit. That's where it actually costs as much energy to get a barrel of oil or a cubic foot of natural gas out of the ground as that oil or gas will give us when we burn it. At that point, when we get to that point, the whole exercise becomes completely pointless. But we're getting perilously close, especially with fracking for shale gas and tight oil, to that energy in equals energy out limit. And that is gradually undermining the economic viability and dynamism of the global economy, and particularly the U.S. economy. And we feel that in lots of different ways. Economic growth is gradually slowing, and the economy is getting more and more unequal because those who have the ability are grabbing what wealth is left as the wealth generating engine starts to slow down. The oil and gas industry is, most of us who are sort of environmental activists have this idea in our mind that the oil and gas industry is sort of, politically and economically all powerful, and we're having to fight against it. And certainly that historically that's true. But it's also true that the oil and gas industry is very sick right now, and levels of profit are quickly declining. Discoveries are disappearing, and this is a story that we don't hear about that much because the oil and gas industry, of course, has a great interest in not publicizing it. Of course, while that's going on, the climate picture is getting worse and worse, and we're seeing that the forecast for rates of actual warming and of sea level rise, of loss of biodiversity, and so on. The forecasts that were made just a few years ago are being exceeded by actual data as it's emerging. Just the last week or so, the Arctic has been below freezing. Here at what should be the coldest time of year, we're seeing record temperatures in the Arctic. Well, of course, that's a kind of fluke, but we're seeing more and more flukes of that kind, and it's happening faster than we anticipated. But as I hope I've been making clear, climate change is not the only way we should be understanding the crises facing us. If we look at the global environmental crisis just in terms of climate change, I think we're really missing it. Another way of thinking of it is in terms of how our consumption rates have overshot the sustainable rate of production for Earth's primary sources of productivity. And there's an organization called the Global Footprint Network that keeps track of this. And they're figuring that, if the whole world were as consuming at the US rate, US standard of living, we would need something like 4 Earths. Now, of course, we don't have 4 Earths. So how are we overshooting Earth's productivity? Well, by drawing down future carrying capacity. And we're doing this by, mining non-renewable resources and overusing renewable resources like forests and fisheries and so on. I think overshoot is really the best way of framing our overall ecological crisis. We are drawing down carrying capacity. We're overshooting carrying capacity because we have the ability to, on a short-term basis, using energy from fossil fuels. But that ability to overshoot carrying capacity will be going away as time goes on. And meanwhile, the degradation of carrying capacity as a result of climate change, overuse of renewable resources and drawdown of non-renewable resources will impact future generations. And so we're in this very perilous space right now, where we're going to have to somehow adjust to the Earth's real carrying capacity, even as that declines. So can't we just unplug all of those nasty coal power plants and plug in solar panels and keep on living the way we've been accustomed to? Well, unfortunately, it's not going to be that easy. That's one of the problems of framing our crisis just in terms of climate change. If we think of it only in terms of climate change, then why not just keep on living the way we have been, only with renewable power instead of oil, coal, and natural gas? Well, we did a deep dive study of this. I co-authored this book along with David Fridley, who's staff scientist in the energy analysis program at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and we looked at all of the constraints and opportunities of the renewable energy transition. And very quickly, renewable energy and nuclear, for that matter, produce electricity, but we only use about 20% of our total energy in the form of electricity. So the energy transition is going to involve an enormous amount of retooling of infrastructure, transport infrastructure, of course, not just electric cars, but how about the aviation industry, trucking, shipping, and so on. Also industrial processes, heating houses and buildings, etc. So this is a huge infrastructure project that we're talking about. Also, solar and wind power are intermittent, so buffering that intermittency will require lots of storage, redundant capacity, and demand management. And all of these things will come with a cost. So even if building solar panels and wind turbines is now cheaper than building new coal power plants or natural gas plants, we also have to factor in these other costs that increasingly come into play as intermittent sources of energy make up a larger and larger proportion of the entire energy portfolio. And then there's the fact that the pace of investment in renewables has actually flatlined in recent years. So even though, again, we've been doing well in terms of building more solar and more wind, we're not building nearly enough to get us where we need to be. One recent study by a colleague of mine named Ugo Bardi and colleagues looked at what would be the needed pace of transition to renewables to offset both depletion of fossil fuels and also in order to get us where we need to be in terms of mitigating catastrophic climate change. They figured we need to be moving about 10 times our current pace in transitioning to renewable energy. So that's not happening, and it's certainly not happening with the Trump administration in place. So final slide in this segment, we're approaching a transformative moment. We are in a transformative moment. Economic growth is slowing down and ending and probably reversing for all of the reasons I've discussed. We're facing a massive requirement for new investment, not just in energy, but also in all the ways we use energy, transport infrastructure, new infrastructure from industrial processes like the concrete and cement industry, steel, new building processes, and so on. Meanwhile, environmental impacts are soaring, not only as a result of climate change, but other pollution impacts and depletion impacts. And globalization is about to reverse, regardless of government policy, because so much of our transport is fossil fueled. And we're not going to be able to change that fast enough to maintain our current rates of global trade. So these are enormous challenges. I haven't talked as much about economic inequality, but I did mention that economic inequality has been on the rise largely because economic growth has been slowing. And it's been the tendency for those with prior advantage to seek to maintain that advantage and increase that advantage. And economic inequality is itself a destabilizing element within societies, has been historically, and it is today. So we're going to have to somehow deal with all of these things. And it's not happening at the global or national level nearly to the degree it needs to. And especially here in the US now with the Trump administration, where we are seeing hopeful signs and good work is mostly at the local level. And that's why we at Post Carbon Institute have focused on local community resilience building as the primary strategy for dealing with these, what we call E4 crises, energy, environment, equity, and economy. So what are these 6 foundations? I'll go through them very quickly. The first one is, if I can get the slide to advance. There we go. No, please come back. Please advance slide, please. Here we go. Yes. First, okay, we'll go back to number 1. The first one is people. Now, this should be, intuitively obvious. Everything is if something happens, it's because people are doing it. But we tend to lose sight of this sometimes in resilience building work because we get focused on large-scale infrastructure or, the importance of getting policymakers and planners on board and maybe big funders and so on. But communities are products of human relationships, and resilience building is most effective when local stakeholders are engaged and invested. So if you are interested in doing resilience building work, you have to find out who those local stakeholders are and get them on board. That's the most important work. They're often the most knowledgeable people about the community's opportunities and challenges, and they're the best suited people to act on them through whatever economic, political, and social relationships exist. It's only the people of a community who can define the identity of that community. And it's the identity of the community that we want to determine, because that's what resilience is all about, making the identity of the community able to persist in the face of the various challenges that are converging.
Richard, this is Daniel. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got to move on to Rebecca. So maybe just briefly mention the next 5.
Yeah, I see the time has gotten away. So the second one is systems thinking. We have to not just look at our challenges in a piecemeal fashion, but think in terms of how they interact with one another. And there are lots of great resources for learning systems thinking if you're not familiar with it, including a wonderful book by Donella Meadows called Thinking in Systems. Adaptability, resilience is really very much or all about adapting to change. And I talked about some of the changes we're going to have to adapt to. But it's not just a matter of adapting the existing community to whatever changes they are. Also, the community itself is going to have to transform in order to be adaptable. So transformability is also an essential aspect of this whole process. Sustainability is important because as we're transforming the community, we need to make it more sustainable over the long term. There's a very close relationship between resilience and sustainability, but they're not the same thing. And finally, we're all going to need a lot of courage because this is going to be a challenging time. And if you've been in communities during times of crisis, as I have recently here in Sonoma County with the fires that destroyed thousands of structures here in Santa Rosa just a few months ago, you know that people can be very courageous in times of crisis, and people have a natural tendency to pull together. Well, those qualities are things we need to draw on and encourage as we move into this time, and do so with a sense of optimism and positive vision, because these are the things that help people come together and creatively face our converging challenges. Okay, so that's enough for me.
Thank you so much, Richard. Sorry to rush you along there. So let me introduce our next speaker then. And by the way, I forgot to mention, or maybe Sarah mentioned, we see your questions coming in on the screen there. And if we have time at the end, we'll get to them. If not, I will make a point to email questions to the individual presenters, and they can respond to you if they can. So our next presenter is also a contributor to the book, Rebecca Water. She's a national environmental leader whose writing and speaking explores how communities can enhance their resilience to climate impacts via sustainable, equitable approaches to rivers and freshwater resources. She chairs the board of River Network, as well as serves on the board of the Potomac Conservancy and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Okay, over to you, Rebecca.
Great, thanks, Daniel, and thanks, Richard, as well, for the foundation that you have laid. I'm going to be focusing on how to build community resilience through these transformative approaches we were just discussing, in this case, to the built, natural, and human systems by which we manage the water in our lives. So why is it that water is central to community resilience? Fundamentally, it's because of the dual nature of water. Water is both a blessing and a curse for our communities. It's a blessing because, well, it's vital to life. We humans can only live a few days without water. And despite all of the great advances we've made in technology, we still haven't discovered any substitute for water. But water can also be a curse because of the many water-related challenges that are faced by our communities, things like major flood events, as well as frequent nuisance flooding that comes from rising sea levels. We also see deteriorating water quality in our rivers and lakes, and sometimes in our drinking water. And the cost of water unaffordability is becoming more and more of a problem. A recent study done by Michigan State predicts that as much as a third of American households will be facing water affordability problems within the next 5 years. And furthermore, climate change is exacerbating these challenges. It's leading to more extreme precipitation and extended periods of drought. Scientists predict that we'll be seeing 400% increases in the frequency of extreme downpours by the end of this century, as well as decades-long mega droughts. And these extremes are exceeding the design criteria of existing water infrastructure that our communities depend on. So the question is, how can communities transform their relationship to water? How can they protect and restore the positive values like reliable clean water supplies and the quality of life benefits of having access to rivers and lakes for recreation? And at the same time, how can they avoid or minimize the negative aspects like floods and droughts? So the key that I'm presenting to you today is to build community resilience at the water's edge by working with nature and working together with the goals of protecting or restoring the ecological services that we all depend upon, and also by tapping the local knowledge and support and increasing our capacity for collective action. We can think of our community water systems as a three-legged stool with the elements of built, natural, and human components. So the first leg of the stool that I'll talk about are the built systems, the pipes, treatment plants, dams, levees that provide community services ranging from municipal and industrial and agricultural water supply to wastewater and stormwater removal, flood protection, power generation, and transportation. Despite our being the richest country in the world, the built water system in America suffers from aging, inflexible, and expensive infrastructure, as well as these climate extremes that exceed the system capacities. Most US water infrastructure is very old and plagued by leaks and water main breaks. It's been engineered for a single purpose rather than multiple benefits. It's large scale and concentrated, which makes it vulnerable to attack or disaster. And it's inflexible in the face of increasingly extreme weather conditions. This slide shows California's Oroville Dam about a year ago, when it nearly failed because of poorly designed spillways in combination with extreme precipitation that led to a near disaster. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives US water infrastructure a grade of D, and it estimates that we'll need to spend at least $1 trillion over the next 20 years to fix our problems. So thinking about what kinds of solutions communities and regions can use to confront these challenges, they certainly are going to need more resilient solutions. And this can be achieved by a handful of strategies that I'd like to talk about: mimicking nature, using water efficiently and effectively, and making better water infrastructure investments. So one way to mimic natural hydrology is to use green infrastructure. This kind of infrastructure replicates the ecological functions of natural hydrologic features. And for example, the city of Seattle has set a goal of building 12,000 rain gardens, which will capture and store stormwater coming off of Seattle streets, which is currently contributing to water quality problems in Puget Sound. They've got 4,000 built so far, and they're continuing toward their goal of 12,000. Another good approach is to move to small-scale decentralized water systems. As an example, the Charles River Watershed Association in Massachusetts has developed detailed plans for a neighborhood-scale wastewater treatment plant that will use the lost resources in wastewater to generate electric and thermal energy, reclaimed potable water, nutrients, and organic fertilizers. And the sale of these resources will support neighborhood jobs, finances, as well as opportunities for improving environmental and urban resilience. Another strategy for making our built water systems more resilient is to emphasize the efficient and integrated use of water. It's far more efficient to use water-conserving plumbing fixtures and repair leaky pipes than to continue with our high levels of use. And that's something that's being considered right now in Cape Town, South Africa. Another aspect of efficient and integrated use of water is known as One Water, or sometimes integrated water resource management. But this is an approach which coordinates the management of drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater based on the idea that all water is valuable and interconnected. And the biggest challenge to this One Water approach is really that we have outdated policies and siloed bureaucracies when it comes to our water, power, and transportation systems. A third strategy is to use our money wisely, to get on the path to the future by using solutions that are multi-benefit rather than single purpose, and plan for the impacts of climate change. This administration's recent proposal to invest $1.5 trillion to rebuild our nation's infrastructure could be a waste of money if it ignores climate science. According to Michael Kuby, who's a professor at Arizona State, the impact of not considering climate change when planning infrastructure means that you end up building the wrong thing in the wrong place to the wrong standards. And a good example, alternatively, of wise investment comes from a decision that was made in Philadelphia a few years ago to address their combined sewer overflow problems by spending $1 billion for green infrastructure. This was instead of spending $3 billion to build a deep tunnel to store their stormwater overflows. Philadelphia was able to save money that could be used for other community priorities and had many other benefits, such as the ones listed on this slide. So the second leg now of our three-legged stool is the natural water infrastructure that really underpins everything: our rivers, our wetlands, floodplains, watersheds that provide our water supply, recharge our groundwater, protect us from floods and droughts, offer vital fish and wildlife habitat, and really so much more. Natural hydrologic systems suffer from pollution, unsustainable water use, and excessive development, amongst other things. Runoff from agriculture and dirty city streets are the worst sources of pollution, but rivers must also contend with pipeline spills, and our aquifers are faced with industrial contamination. Beyond pollution, we have rivers and aquifers that are overtapped, and not just in the Western United States. And another serious issue is our approach to development. We are paving over the watersheds that generate our water supply, and at just 10 to 15% of an impermeable cover in a watershed, the ecological services that we all depend upon are lost. So there are solutions in this area, in the second leg of the stool, that are well known. They include things like protecting the healthy systems that we have, restoring damaged systems, and repairing the ecological functions of our hydrological resources. In terms of protecting healthy rivers and watersheds, I serve on the board of a local organization called the Potomac Conservancy. And one of the things they've done to protect this river is to buy up a chunk of the headwaters that was threatened by development. And instead now of being developed and paved over, it will be turned into a state park and remain as a healthy source of water for the Potomac River in the years to come. in places where development is going to go ahead and happen anyway, then communities have an opportunity to shape how that development happens through using something called low impact development ordinances, which limit the amount of pavement on a site and encourage the use of things like permeable paving and other forms of green infrastructure. To restore damaged areas, we have here a slide of some people doing some replanting of riparian vegetation, but there are other things that we can do to restore damaged systems. We can remove obsolete dams and restore eroded stream channels. And when it comes to repairing hydrological functions, just one good example is in Washington state, after a major flood, the town of Orting, Washington, chose to repair a functioning floodplain by setting back the levees along the river and giving the river room to spread out. This allowed the town to avoid flood damages when another flood hit the town about 5 years later. The third leg of the stool of our community water management are the human systems, the water laws, water rights, watershed coalitions, irrigation co-ops that create the ability for us to use and share water. This is one of the problems facing this leg of the stool is that we suffer from antiquated laws that too often treat water as private property rather than public good, as well as water management practices that lead to inequities and environmental injustices. Human systems depend on trust and shared values and social networks, and of these, trust is most important and requires equity and fairness. I'm sorry, I just lost my slides. Let me get back to them. Here we go. And I wanted to just take a moment to share with you a definition of water equity that I think is very useful. It's that all communities have access to affordable clean water, are resilient to water-related climate risks, have a role in decision-making on community water services, and share in economic, social, and environmental benefits of water systems. So the solutions that strengthen this leg of the stool include investing fairly in water systems and ensuring diverse and meaningful participation in water-related community decisions. Urban water treatment plants are often located in economically and politically disadvantaged neighborhoods. This presents opportunities to leverage water dollars. For example, in San Francisco, they have a community benefits program that leverages water infrastructure dollars to do workforce development and capital projects that revitalize urban neighborhoods. So where and how can communities begin implementing these solutions? When deciding where to focus water-related planning and projects, it's important to ask which neighborhoods face the most serious water problems and where are water-related threats most likely to harm communities. Low-income communities are more likely to be in harm's way, whether that means living and working near polluting facilities or in high flood danger zones. And this, of course, is a shot from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. So how to begin? Again, to me, the key is to work with nature and work together. The cool thing about water is that it offers so many opportunities for engagement at the local level. Water brings diverse people together. The common identity of living in the same watershed and depending on the same water resources offers important opportunities for building bridges between different groups, and water protection projects that offer opportunities for hands-on engagement and show tangible results in a short time, which rewards people for their efforts and reinforces a sense of purpose and accomplishment that expands civic engagement and builds on community pride and cohesion. So to quickly summarize, to work together, focus on the most vulnerable communities, address inequities and injustices, and connect around common interests in water to achieve cohesion in combination with diversity. And in terms of working with nature, follow natural principles for good design solutions that are redundant, flexible, and multi-purpose. connect and integrate water systems across watersheds, and reduce barriers and create incentives to replicate small-scale solutions. My closing thought, it comes from architect Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. I think this is the core of transformative approaches that we're going to need for water based on working with nature and working together. These will make our communities more resilient. Thanks very much for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. So in the few minutes that we have left, I'm going to try to get to 2 questions, one for each of our speakers. Real quick, I just want to make a quick observation that if we had an hour, I would love to dive into this with both Richard and Rebecca. You could see in Rebecca's presentation that she was touching on many of the things that Richard mentioned in the 6 foundations. And one of the reasons why we felt the 6 foundations are so important is that it gives you this framework for understanding why individual projects like the stormwater remediation and the larger watershed preservation and all the different things that Rebecca talked about, how those all hang together and build the resilience of this larger social ecological system, which is the community that she's working in. That these aren't just the individual community projects, which is kind of how we used to think about them, I think maybe back in the 90s and the 2000s, the first decade of the century, but they are part of this, they all kind of work toward this larger goal. So those are the sorts of things that we really try to explore in the book, and I encourage you, of course, to read it. So let me start with a question for Rebecca. This is a rather long question, but maybe you can give a fairly short answer if you can. David asked, how should grassroots activists utilize a watershed-based management approach for things like nutrients, toxins, habitat restoration, wildlife conservation in the face of all the changes being considered by the EPA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers?
Well, I guess in the interest of time, I'm going to focus just on one thing about watersheds, which I think is important, really, no matter what grassroots problem might be at hand, whether it's nutrients or anything else. And that is the fact that watersheds operate like they're nested. They're like Russian dolls in a sense. So smaller watersheds come together to create larger and larger watersheds. And what that attribute means is that you can work on a problem in a small stream's watershed, but you can also connect what you're doing in that stream to the larger and larger system of of which it is a part. And that means that we can have very local grassroots efforts combined then with larger and larger efforts, and it's through that combination of working on the ground, but then finding the scaling up through the larger watersheds that I think we can start to grapple with the many complex problems affecting water and affecting our need for clean, healthy, reliable, secure sources of water.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. And oh wow, there's some great questions that just came in. I wish we had time for them. But Richard, for our last one, I'll give you one that came in early, which, boy, you could probably talk for half an hour on this one. This is from Marty Roach. She asked, can't we look for growth, assuming she means economic growth, through services and through the work and economic activity generated by the transition to renewable energy?
Right. Yeah, this is a complicated question. Our analysis, which you can read at ourrenewablefuture.org, suggests that almost inevitably the amount of energy available as we make the energy transition, the amount of energy available nationally and globally, will decline. Now, we're using energy at a historically high pace now. And the use of energy inevitably entails environmental impacts, regardless of the source of energy, because all of the things we use energy for involve extracting and transforming resources and involve wastes and so on. So, in fact, a reduction in energy is both necessary and inevitable. But there's historically a very high correlation between energy usage and economic growth. Again, we see the most likely trajectory leading us toward a future of declining economic activity And that need not be a bad thing if we plan for it and integrate it into our communities. And that's, of course, going to have huge implications for equity, because right now so much wealth is locked up in so few hands. And so the prospect of declining economic activity is very frightening for a lot of people, and it need not be, but it's a paradigm shift that will be required in order for us to make this transition in a happy way, which again I believe is fully possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. We are out of time. Thank you to everyone. As I mentioned, I'm going to forward your questions on to the presenters by email afterwards, so you all get your questions asked, and I'll turn it back over to Sarah for the closeout.
Thank you all. This has been great. I'm so excited about all of the interest. And thank you again, Daniel, for addressing the questions. As you can see on the slide, we have a 20% off discount for the Community Resilience Reader. So we encourage you to pick up your copy today. And we're at 4 o'clock, so I will let you all go and have a lovely afternoon. Take care, you all.
All right. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.